the four that I mentioned as being, I think, fairly core practices, namely cognitive, psychodynamic, meditative, and physical, particularly weightlifting, continue to be the ones that I touch in with most often. And for me in particular, one of the really strong changes I had was when I started doing weightlifting, which really wasn't until quite late into the game for me. Very tall, I'm 6'4", 6'5", and for most of my adult life I weighed around 170 pounds. And that's, technical term is cerebrotonic ectomorph. It means painfully skinny intellectual is the translation. So we're basically just one big, neuronal center with a thin line of body nutritional support. The support system sort of barely dangling down under the brain. And what I found is that as I would sit and do writing and then sit and do meditation, it was ridiculous because that actually takes a lot of muscles to sit in one place and not move for a long time. So what happened really starting about 15 years ago, I really went on a prolonged, just really systematic resistance training or weightlifting program. And over a very long period, because people that are skinny do have a hard time putting on muscle, but it can be done. And I went from 170 pounds to about 200 pounds. And it was a huge change for me. Because even if you're sitting at a desk for 8 or 10 hours a day, you can circulate prana, you can circulate bioenergy if you're not constantly sort of not being able to hold yourself up really in a certain sense. And that to me was a big change, because I think like so many intellectuals or even meditators, the idea is you can sort of, the aesthetic approach is just we're going to transcend the body, so let that sucker just waste away, we don't care. And it was a real change for me. It was, even though I'd been an integral thinker for a long time, I think it was one of the most important things I did in terms of trying to be a little bit more integral in my own orientation. It seems very simple and very almost prosaic, but it really can be quite profound. And that's remained a cornerstone. I think and I did yoga for 15, 20 years at first. I still do that, but I think a judicious combination of yoga and weightlifting really does help. And once you get yourself in shape, it's not much more really than 15 minutes 3 times a week. You really can keep what you've done if you do that. And the physiological markers, they really do, it's staggering. So much so that Bob Arnott, the house physician on ABC News, so this is a very conservative doctor, in reviewing all of the research, including research done with people 70 years old, Emory University, lift weights for 6 months, and their physiological age markers go from 70 years to 58 years old. It turns it back 12 years. So he's summarized all of the empirical research to date by saying the old paradigm was aerobics is everything. In other words, everybody thought you just sort of run. If you do, all sorts of disease markers start going up. I mean, long distance runners drop dead of everything at a high rate. The new paradigm is muscles are the engine of youth. So it sets in motion a whole series of physiological changes in the body that can be very, very helpful. And I think that's why it increases your capacity for concentration, and therefore you do Vipassana better, among other things. So that's been real important. I continue to do that. Cognitive, it might sound funny, because cognitive, a lot of people have a misunderstanding about cognitive. They think it means linear, logic, abstract thinking. That's an extremely small part of what cognitive is. Cognitive really means consciousness, and cognitive psychologists use it to mean cognition is the capacity to take perspectives. So you can take a first-person perspective, but in order for me to try to see the world through your eyes, to understand you as an individual person, to put myself in your shoes and walk in your shoes for a while, my body can't do that. If I'm going to just feel my feelings, I'm feeling my feelings. To look at your perspective, that's a mental act. I have to mentally put myself in your shoes. So cognition is the way we get to a second-person perspective, and a third person, and so on. So some people say, well, there's cognition, and then, but there's love, and that's more feeling, and that's the spiritual component. That's backwards. If I'm going to love you as something other than an extension of myself, I have to be able to see you. And if I can't see you and understand what you want as a separate person, I can't love you. Seeing your perspective is cognition. So the cognitive line, research has consistently shown, is necessary but not sufficient for all the other lines of development. So it doesn't mean that you have to sit and study calculus. That's a very, very narrow, abstract thing that you can do Saturday night if you can't get a date, but other than that, it just means, what we're trying to do when we ask you to learn the AQUA model, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, is it's stretching you. You're taking other perspectives when you do that. And that creates a clearing or a space in your consciousness that your other potentials can rise into. And so we find that you can have a peak experience. You can even have a Kensho or a Satori, because those are states. But if you don't have a cognitive development that can hold it, it'll slip. So I've found just increasingly just engaging a cognitive program helps you, it stretches your mind to take more and more perspectives and more sentient beings. And if you look at most of the great contemplative traditions, look at Tibetan Buddhism, for example, probably the most complete meditative contemplative system anywhere in the world. And fully half of a monk's day is spent in intellectual debate. It's taking the role of others, using the mind so you can transcend the mind. So that's remained very important. And the last one is psychodynamic, because constantly what we find in the great spiritual traditions is that although they excelled in many, many things, they weren't very good at spotting psychodynamic, unconscious shadow issues. And because of that, even great spiritual teachers and masters, men or women, and east or west, north or south, they can make great strides and even have a stabilized, realized awareness. But there can be little components of themselves that don't yield to that awareness. And they're down there, and they're these shadow elements, and they really cause problems. They're probably the single biggest saboteur of spiritual practice. And it's one of the great things that the West, modern West, has added to our understanding. So those four are still the ones that I touch in with the most. And periodically you extend it. You try to work with interpersonal relationships, organizational relationships. For me, who spent most of my life writing, and to step into a position of administrative work at things like Integral Institute and Integral University that's a big module. It's winning, but that's another way you can continue to grow and develop.